Drama 2, Reviewing a Meaning of Anxiety by Rollo May. So another psychologist gets quoted. These are all dead now. I think they're all dead. They're not currently alive. Is someone called Alfred Adler. And I have heard of him before in my other reading. But Alfred Adler is the person who coined the inferiority complex. I don't know if you've heard of the inferiority complex, but it's the inferiority complex. It was coined by Alfred Adler. And he argues, and I think this is really interesting, that inferiority feelings can result in anxiety. That everyone, begins life in a state of biological inferiority and insecurity. If you think how vulnerable a baby is. But we normally overcome this helplessness and achieve security through social relationships. But factors that increase inferiority, there are factors that increase inferiority, for example, social discrimination, and these are very real objective factors that can make someone feel even more, inferior than typical. But the crucial factor in terms of whether or not the person then develops a kind of neurosis is their subjective attitude towards the objective weakness. Again, might be objectively weak, and I guess someone who's disabled is objectively weak. If you're autistic, you are objectively kind of inferior. And I'm saying this in I don't mean we are actually inferior, but in terms of our in one sense we are, in a sense that we're not as capable in certain areas, social areas mainly, than typical people. But this doesn't necessarily mean that we then go on to think that we are inferior subjectively, because that depends on our interpretation of our condition, of our disabilities. And interestingly, though, that the highly anxious person who develops an inferiority complex, because that's not inevitable that someone's going to develop an inferiority complex, but if you have a disability, it might become a bit more likely. They might try and then compensate for that by developing a superiority complex to try and compensate against the feeling of inferiority. So it's all about perception, really, he argues. How one views the objective weakness is key. I'm going to be honest here, I do have an inferiority complex. It developed around my teenage years. I admit it, I do have an inferiority complex. I think it's quite common if you're disabled to have an inferiority complex. I don't have a superiority complex, but I do have an inferiority complex, yes. Particularly around other autistics who I compare myself against them, and it makes me feel resentful. I don't know if any of you can relate. The ones who are more successful, I mean. So, yes, I do struggle with that. Moving on to my notes. Sorry, I took these notes. I can't go through all of them, just irrelevant bits. Oh yes, so getting back on the topic of anxiety more broadly. So, as I mentioned earlier, anxiety is unspecific, it's vague, it's objectless, it's uncertainty in the face of danger. Anxiety lasts longer than fear as it is not connected or attached to an object. For example, you might have fear when you're about to have a tooth is about to be pulled, or you're in the dentist chair. That is fear. But anxiety is worrying about it beforehand or worrying about what happened afterwards, and that lasts longer and is more disabling than, say, fear. Anxiety is the apprehension cued off by a threat to some value the individual holds essential to his existence as a personality. So it may be physical, it may be to physical life, death, or to psychological existence. For example, the loss of freedom, meaninglessness. In fear, there is a relation to a given. In fear, the relation to a given object is important. If the object is removed, the apprehension disappears. But anxiety goes deeper because it attacks the core of the personality, and you cannot stand outside the threat. You're powerless to take steps to confront it. And anxiety, the security pattern itself is threatened. It threatens the basis of selfhood because you might actually cease to exist as a self because it threatens your very identity. And things like death, fatigue and illness, these all threaten the catastrophic state of non-being. I can really relate to that. It's part of the reason why I'm so scared of those things, because they are, essentially they do threaten that sense of meaning that you're trying to build up in your life. There's the fear of becoming nothing. He argues that it is courageous to work through the anxiety connected with the threat of self-dissolution, because it's only by working through the anxiety that you can then strengthen your sense of distinction from objects and non-being. By strengthening your experience of being a self, I guess it's a bit like you're strengthening your experience of being a self by pushing through the anxiety, because then you can show that you do have efficacy in the face of the anxiety. You're not just like being passive and letting the anxiety run your life, as it were, but obviously that's easier said than done. He does argue that brain-injured patients' vulnerability to threats is not neurotic but real, and I thought that's really interesting. And I think there are parallels there with autism, although autism isn't technically like brain injury in the sense that he's talking about. It's a developmental thing that you're born with. Obviously, the brain is different. You might say disordered, some people might say different, but there is a difference in the brain. But I think maybe it could be maybe a little bit related to autism in a sense that the people that he talks about, First World War combat veterans with brain lesions, these are incredibly orderly patients. They can't bear any changes to their routine. If they were to find the objects in their closet in disarray, this might actually be an objective threat because of their curtailed capacities, they cannot then orient themselves to the objects. And he argues the same might be true for very young infants, because that poses real threats, and I'm thinking it could also be true for people with autism, and I think that's why, because we do struggle more with the world, and just struggling to understand the world, to organise our perceptions of the world, it's more chaotic, it's more confusing. So actually, when things are in disorder, are we really experiencing neurotic anxiety, or is this actually a very genuine, real response to a situation that is real for us, even though non-autistics might not understand it? So maybe it's a mistake to call autistics with anxiety neurotic, because it could actually be a very real response in terms of the fact that we really do need the environment to be orderly. That's not neurotic, it's because of our genuine, real biological problems understanding the world, and that is so important for us, that everything is orderly, because that helps us cope. Just as it would be completely absurd to call an infant neurotic. He argues that genuine neurotic anxiety is a subjective inner conflict where even minor threats trigger anxiety, and it's an excessive vulnerability to threats, and that neurotic anxiety is that which occurs when an incapacity for coping adequately with the threats is not objective but subjective. So that would be someone who has all the mechanisms available to them to be able to cope with their environment, so like a completely typical person in all other respects, but they've got this subjective conflict going on within them. I think maybe it's possible to have a bit of both. I do have objective anxiety because I'm autistic, but I also think I maybe also have some of that subjective conflict going on as well, so maybe it's a little bit of both for me. He argues that neurotic anxiety is due not to objective weaknesses, but inner conflicts which prevent individual from using their powers. Because it'd be a bit like in autism when we get anxious over sensory issues and overstimulation and things like that. That's not neurotic, that's a genuine anxiety. But neurotic anxiety might be when we say over-exaggerate risks and things like that. Or where we kind of think that, or where the autism itself causes unnecessary anxiety, that maybe it's more to do with a subjective interpretation of the autism, like kind of starting to think that we're inferior and things like that, and that's something that's a bit more subjective, and that maybe could be worked through with therapy. Whereas our anxiety over sensory issues is a real anxiety that we need to work on in a more real, objective way. And it also argues that every human would experience anxiety in a situation of threats to their vital values, but what the individual regards as a situation of threat is due to learning, because it depends on what our values are. Anxiety is basic, it's an original response to threat, and because it is a response to threat on a basic level of personality, to get essence of personality, that's why it's so catastrophic. The anxiety is the apprehension that one will not be able to cope with the dangers as they arise, and anxiety can also give rise to hostility because you're angry towards those responsible for placing you in such a situation of pain. So anxiety is often present below the hostility. I can relate to that. I mean, anger is the other side of anxiety, isn't it? You also often get extremely angry as well. Anger itself and anxiety, I think, are very close bedfellows. They're the only two emotions I really get. They're always extreme in me. I don't get subtle emotions. It's like all or nothing for me. But yes, anger, definitely. Rage attacks now and again. But they are over quite quickly. They're like, and then down. Back down again. So it's also argued that anxiety is more prevalent nowadays because of the individualistic, competitive pattern inherent in capitalism. Possibilities for success are threatened, the isolation from others. Self-validation depends on the triumphing of others in our very competitive system. I could definitely relate to that. I think that the competitive world order that we live in does encourage us to compare ourselves against others and to get more anxious, because say if we lived in a more collective society based upon common values. Interestingly, it's argued that in a study on men under stress by R. Grinker, it's argued that an anxious airman would be the first to get himself in the air and into a situation of danger, the danger itself being less painful than the anticipation. And I can really relate to that I can really relate to that, because often it's the anticipation that is more scary than the actual reality of what you're facing. It's like when you face it, it's never as bad as you thought. And I can really relate to this because sometimes, for example, when I want to try new food, before COVID, obviously, when I could go into the shops, I would be really scared about it and I'd be obsessing about it. But I really wanted to try new food. It was like I really wanted to go forward. But sometimes, because I was so scared, I would just go ahead and do it straight away, because I'd rather do it straight away than have all this time spent worrying about it. So sometimes it's like you dive into that which you fear just to get it over with, because it's never as bad as the anticipation. So I can really, really relate to that. Anyhow, I'm going to stop now. I've almost finished this review, but I don't want the video to run out on me, and I've talked long enough, but I will be coming back to this next week to finish off the review. There's not much more I want to say, but yeah, just a few other points I wanted to touch upon to do with the connection of anxiety and interests. Okay, so I'm going to finish now, so thank you for watching.